Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us this morning at the Bill is Due. I'm Eric Garner, the managing partner of Best & Krieger. Before we get going today, I want to make a special thanks to our marketing folks, Denise Nix, Lisa Macias, and Ashley Fernandez, as well as Anna Schwab from our DC Government Relations Group. She could not be here today, but Denise and Lisa and Ashley are, so if you can join me in thanking them. Richard Nixon, who I feel like I have to say something about since we're here at his presidential library. Richard Nixon had an extraordinary presidency. He certainly, accomplished a number of things, some of them very relevant to what we're talking about here today. He signed the Clean Air Act, he signed the Clean Water Act, created the Environmental Protection Agency, obviously opened relations with China and further relations with the Soviet Union. However, of course, I can still remember the day when I was, I think, 10 years old and I flipped on the TV and Star Trek wasn't on and there was some hearing on and there was some guy talking, and it was apparently a big deal about how they'd recorded these conversations in the White House. And so, of course, 50 years later, he is still perhaps best remembered for Watergate and that scandal that ultimately caused him to resign. And I was thinking about that this morning in the context of these issues and how we will be thought of 50 years from now. And I think, there are incredible things that have been accomplished in this generation. But when it comes to the environment and infrastructure and pensions, if we don't address these issues in some way, in some significant way, we may well be remembered 50 years from now for failing to deal with them, rather than the many fine things that have been accomplished. And I think the great thing about living in California is, it's a wonderful place to live, and we have the advantage and disadvantage of leading, the country, the nation, and often the world. And we've led it in many positive ways over the years. Post-World War II, certainly construction and education, housing, jobs, prosperity, frankly, and more recently in technology. But also leading means that sometimes we confront the most difficult issues. And so it is in dealing with infrastructure. The infrastructure we built here is incredible, but maintaining it and improving it is an enormous task. The government benefits and pension system is amazing too, but again, maintaining it is an extraordinary task. And it's a beautiful place to live because of the environment, but that's a very sensitive environment, and we have a substantial impact on it, and taking care of it while continuing to prosper is also an extraordinary challenge. And none of these issues is unique to California. Many other states have them. Many other places in the world have them. And in fact, one could argue that we are better positioned than most to solve those problems because of the extraordinary human capital we have, as well as the financial capital. And I am, ultimately optimistic that we will solve them, but of course that doesn't mean the solutions are going to be easy. And that's why we're here today. Certainly appreciate all of you attending. None of you are here by accident. You were all invited, and you're all invited because you play a critical role in responding to these challenges on a daily basis. The communities that you're in rely on you for the solutions, and they should appreciate the fact that you've made the effort to be here today to gather more information to help with those solutions. And speaking on behalf of BBK, you're all important to us, and that's why we wanted you here today. We want you to have all the knowledge that's available to help you develop those solutions. Lastly, I just want to say this is not a huge group, and sometimes the best way to get information is to ask questions. So please feel free to do so throughout the day, and also after today, you can follow, I think the hashtag is up there, BBK Fund the Future, as well as signing up for webinars. There's some sign-up sheets outside. There are already webinars planned on transportation and pensions, and that can be a great way to raise new issues, hear about new issues, and things like that. So please don't let this be the end of the conversation, but rather the beginning of the conversation. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who I'm very excited to introduce, having had the privilege of hearing him before. Our first speaker is Michael Rogers. He's a practical futurist. I'll let him explain what that means. He recently served as futurist in residence for the New York Times. And he's worked with companies ranging from FedEx and NBC Universal to Microsoft and Shell. He was a writer for Rolling Stone magazine. He co-founded Outside magazine. He launched Newsweek's technology column. He was vice president of the Washington Post Company's new media division. He earned patents for that work. He's also a best-selling novelist whose books are published worldwide. And in addition to all those things, he studied physics and creative writing, there's a combo, at Stanford University, and he also did additional work at the Stanford Business School Executive Program. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce Michael Rogers. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you much, Eric, for that kind introduction, and it is a real pleasure to be here today. I'm not going to take a lot of time because you're going to hear more from me at lunch, and you do not want a futurist overload today. But I did want to say a few remarks. First of all, when Sean Haggerty, the chair of the conference, first called me about 8 months ago to describe this, it immediately struck a chord with me. I spent lots of time going to conferences, moderating or speaking at conferences. And what struck me right away was the inclusive nature of this, the way that it brought together different issues. In a sense, I think all under the idea of infrastructure. I've always felt that in public policy, infrastructure should mean almost everything, education and healthcare. I mean, this is all part of our infrastructure that helps us thrive. And it's interesting, though, that all too often gets analyzed piece by piece, and we only realize the relationships between them when something goes wrong. Classic example, I was working with a big utilities company in the Northeast last year on their grid modernization project, which is a very good, very important thing that everyone's doing in the United States. And they'd come to an interesting sticking point. There was a very large transformer that they needed to replace with a modern transformer, but unfortunately, the only access to it was on a bridge that had now become unstable and would not support the weight of the new transformer as it went over the bridge. So now they were stuck with two pieces of infrastructure that they couldn't use, and actually I'm not quite sure how they even managed to sort that one out. So I think it's terrific that we're looking at things in this sort of context situation. I've worked in journalism for many years, sort of trying to think about what the future would be like, and I'm not positive we succeeded completely there. We're still really struggling, but when I think back, I really wish that at the time, in the late 90s, the early parts of this century, we had stepped back a little bit more to see how all the parts interrelated. For example, one example would be how our relative monopoly, which then existed because of we had the cable channel, we had the broadcasting tower, we had the printing press, how that affected really fundamental parts of our behavior that we thought were just sort of natural good behavior. That kind of insight, I think, is very, very useful in planning the future. So let me just say a couple words about the future. You'll hear more about that from me later. It was actually starting at the New York Times that they called me a futurist. Prior to that, I sort of made fun of futurists. That once they gave me the title, and I tried to talk them out of it, actually, but they finally insisted, and just as a point of information, if the New York Times wants to call you something and it's not absolutely awful, just go with it. So people at parties would ask me, what do you do as a futurist? And I would immediately tell them I don't do stocks, the lottery, or sports. And they would immediately lose interest in me. You don't have that luxury. But in fact, I think the three things that we can predict with some useful insight, one is technology, one is demographics. The demographic wheel turns slowly, and we can look out and see what is going to affect us in the next 10 to 15 years. And then, oddly, the third one that I've added recently is the weather. More specifically, extreme weather. It's not that we can predict the weather exactly, but we can almost certainly count on the weather that we have being more extreme. So those three things are kind of what I build my vision of the future with. And I'll just sort of conclude with one quick thought about what you do once you have that vision of the future, because that's often, especially in large organizations, where things stop. What do you do with this vision of the future? And what I've come to believe is that having an idea of what the future might be like and how we might might meet it, having that vision is a point out on the horizon towards which we navigate. And going towards the future is very much like sailing upwind. You can't go directly to the point on the horizon because the staff isn't trained, you don't have the resources yet, your existing equipment isn't amortized. There's always some reason in the operational here and now that you can't go straight towards the future. So the way we go towards the future is by tacking back and forth, just the way that we sail upwind. So we need to make sure two things at all times. One, that when we look up, we are approximately going in the right direction of our vision of the future. And then the second one is, because we're sailing into the wind, make sure that we're not actually getting blown backwards by our actions. So I'm going to talk a little more about some of those ideas at lunch, but for now, I'm going to turn it over to Adi Tomer, who Adi is from the Brookings Institute. He's a fellow there who actually studies all of these pieces, the infrastructure, built environment portfolio, transportation, and the panel that he will lead is our panel on putting this puzzle all together.